threats Israel. I think there is no point in fudging on this. That is their aim. The question is, can they do it? If it was up to the West, they would have done it because the collaboration, the military support is so great. But what has prevented this from happening, especially in recent years, is not the official Palestinian organizations, whether it's the PLO, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, or Hamas, but huge mobilizations from below, by citizens, by young people, by students who will not give up. And that is what was decisive in this battle too. Many people are taking the credit for it, but credit should go to the citizens of Jerusalem who started fighting back against the ethnic cleansing, the support and solidarity for them that developed in occupied Palestine and then in historic Palestine, and finally the decision by Hamas to lob a few rockets over the border, which resulted in the usual Israeli response. And then we've had something we've had before. The UN Security Council calls for a ceasefire. The Israelis refuse, the Americans refuse. Then the Americans accept. The Israelis say, okay, we know the Americans have accepted the ceasefire. We're going to bomb for another day. Just sheer bravado, killer's bravado. And they carry on this bombing. This has happened now 4 or 5 times since 2008. So nothing that is happening is new. In terms of the Palestinians, which are the only people, I think, together with the diaspora and solidarity movements abroad, be able to resist this. I don't know for how long, but they are doing that in total and full solidarity with them. But they are confronted with 2 problems. One is the Israeli government, the occupation, and secondly, they're confronted with a huge problem in the shape of the Palestinian Authority. We have now information, concrete information of what has been going on. Look, the first Intifada, we forget this, it was a 3-year event, 3 years, waves of popular demonstrations. Most of the activists were from newly created universities, and they fought on and on and on. This scared the PLO leadership, let's be blunt. They thought they were being replaced, and had they been, it would have been a huge step forward for Palestine. The Israelis preferred to deal with the notables in the Palestinian areas and the old traditional leadership based in Tunis. And the product of that in 1994 was the Palestinian Authority, which was a joint Israeli-American co-production, and its purposes were essentially to contain resistance to Zionism and the occupation. And they have done that, unfortunately. So when I hear some of their leaders claiming credit for this resistance, one, wants to say pass the sick bag, because it's completely fake and false. This doesn't mean that lots of Palestinians who work with the PLO are not for their cause, but they do it at great risk. And we now also have a very clear picture of how the Palestinian Authority has been run for several years. The United States interferes on every single level, in every single department. Aid is weaponized. It's only given to those people they trust. Special bureaucrats are taken to Washington and trained on how to carry out their work and on how effectively, ideologically, to support the United States. That is the scale of the problem that the Palestinians confront today, and it is going to go on. The latest wave has created sympathy for the first time in the in Congress, partially due to the Squad, due to the fact that they've been raising Palestine, but even beyond them, people have suddenly been a bit shocked. Why didn't they see it before? Well, the young ones didn't, clearly. But the New York Times now publishing a whole page, its front page, with the kids killed in Gaza. Where were they when these kids were being killed some years ago, or in 2008, or in 2014? Where were they? The fact that they are forced to do this is a sign that there is a new generation in US politics as well. The Democratic Socialists, the Democrats basically thinking again, some, not the official leadership, obviously, but within the Democrats, and a new movement for Palestinian solidarity emerging, which, as Shelley said, we saw on the streets of London not so long ago, with young people in their tens of thousands coming out and marching. And this is, to be frank, the only hope that this struggle will continue in Palestine on the grassroots level till they can establish a new leadership, which I hope will be soon, and that the solidarity movement will continue in the rest of the world. The tragedy is that the solidarity in the largest state in that region, Egypt, has been limited because of the repression by the military dictatorship. And even during the Mubarak era, demonstrations for Palestine were permitted. No longer. The restrictions on entering Gaza are much, much tougher and much stricter than they were ever before. So within the Arab world, the masses are still with the Palestinians. And, there were demonstrations in Algeria, in Iraq, or in West Africa, in Senegal, where people came out. But the official line is now very clear. We don't want any trouble with the United States. We're not going to cross them on this. And the fact, and I'll end on this, Shelley, the fact that the Israelis have felt so beleaguered over the last years that the only thing they can now do is run this absurd, ludicrous campaign, labeling every opposition to to Zionism and the activities and atrocities of the Israeli state as anti-Semitism. That doesn't work anymore. For young people, it doesn't work. For old, elderly politicians too, who initially made huge mistakes, in my opinion, the leaders of the Labour Party in accepting the IHRC definition made a huge mistake. And some of us in Stop the War said so publicly at the time, don't do it, it'll end badly for you and for the solidarity movement with Palestine. And that has then been used to basically neuter Jeremy Corbyn, which they haven't succeeded in doing, but the whip has been withdrawn. And the fact that the SCG even signed up to this IHRC is shocking. So in Britain, it's been bad. In Ireland, it's been very good, the solidarity, as you know, talking about these little islands. And in Scotland, too, the mood is different. It's England and within the Labour Party that we've been locked up. So I think we have to stress this non-stop to people, that victory, when it comes, will be brought by the Palestinian people themselves with aid and support and solidarity from abroad, and hopefully including from the United States, where a new generation, including a new generation of Jewish people, are saying enough and no more, we're not going to tolerate this. The older generations in AIPAC are on the same line, but the younger Jewish people in the United States are saying we're not going to tolerate this and our loyalty is not to Israel. And that is beginning to worry them. And that is a response to the resistance, the heroic and courageous resistance of the Palestinians and the solidarity movement abroad. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. I know that you can't stick around, but really grateful to you for sharing your time and thoughts tonight. I think it's a really interesting point about this new, younger generation of people who are much more inclined to support Palestine, inspired, as you say, by the resistance. We know that public opinion has shifted massively in support for the Palestinians here. We know that we have to mobilize that support. You also mentioned the so-called squad in the US, and I think our next speaker, were there an equivalent here in Britain, would be in it. She's a member of parliament who has been a strong supporter of international peace and justice for many years. In the last few weeks, she's attended the demonstrations for Palestine in both London and Leicester, which is her home city, and surely a city of solidarity. I'm sure many of you will have seen the Leicester City players who held up the Palestinian flag after the FA Cup win. She's the MP for Leicester East. Please welcome Claudia Webbe.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you for that introduction. Of course, I come from a city of protest, and if anybody wants to know where I learnt my protest from, it is, of course, Leicester. We are the city of protest, and it's a pleasure to join you all today. I would of course like to start by thanking Stop the War, not only for organising today's important event, but also for all the work they do in service of peace and global justice. So I'm here today in full solidarity with everyone, of course, not only on the call today, but around the world who is protesting against the oppression of Palestine. And I stand with the Palestinian people, of course, in their struggle for peace and justice. We, all of us, have borne witness to hundreds killed in Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, including many, many children whose innocence actually reveals the horror and trauma of this massacre. The latest massacre has displaced tens of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and destroyed electricity, water, and hygiene, every possible infrastructure you can think of to necessitate our basic needs. The sites targeted include hospitals, office blocks containing media organizations like Al Jazeera and the Associated Press in Gaza, and the largest residential building in Gaza as well. The ceasefire announced brings no end to the torment and torture, of course, and no justice for the decades of marginalization, elimination, and suffering of the Palestinian people. The systemic violence against Palestinians and the illegal Israeli occupation is an international atrocity and was found by a recent Human Rights Watch report to amount to effectively an apartheid state regime. The short-term set of causes for this latest violent event include internal power struggles within Israel and the eviction of Palestinian residents from Sheikh Jarrah. Yet we know the long-term context, which is systematically underreported in media accounts of this. It lays bare the historical oppression of the Palestinian people. The recent violations are part of an ongoing process of the Nakba that started in 1948, where, as we know, over 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes and instantly made refugees. Since occupying the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, Israel has unilaterally declared tens of thousands of hectares of state land for Israeli settlements, a process that is illegal under international laws of war and occupation. 2020 saw the highest rate of settlement expansion in East Jerusalem on record, and over 1,500 Palestinians are under threat of their homes being demolished and forcibly displaced. The Gaza Strip, as we know, is effectively an open-air prison, with 97% of the population not having access to clean water, and with each Israeli bombing campaign further eroding living standards. Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories have been identified by the United Nations as being in breach of international law. The UN Secretary General and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights have called on the Israeli government to abandon the illegal annexation plans. The international community must, of course, recognize the Palestinian state, stand up for the inalienable human rights of Palestinians, and actively support the enforcement of international law. This is a colonial war. Without doubt, it's a colonial war. The UK is historically and contemporarily complicit in this suffering. You know, as Bernard Reagan argues in his book on the Balfour Declaration, the British Empire was instrumental in the displacement and subjugation of Palestinian people. Patrick Wolf, the preeminent scholar of settler colonialism, classifies the relationship between Israel and Palestine as part of occupier and occupied. Understanding this asymmetrical power imbalance is essential in moving towards a future of peace. We cannot ignore the enduring legacy of the British Empire, which carved up the region and left a legacy of instability that persists to this day. Britain still believes it can act with impunity in a region from which they have violently extracted an obscene amount of resources over the centuries. So fast forward to today, and you'll understand this. With all that is said by the international community, the UK government is still licensing arms. What will it take? What will it take for the UK to stop? The UK government has licensed at least 361 million worth of arms sale to Israel since 2014. The Campaign Against Arms Trade reported that it is likely that UK-made arms have been used against Palestinians. And I have urged the government to end all sales of weapons that could be used unlawfully against Palestinian people. Across the British media landscape, this crisis is routinely reported as a conflict between equals, rather than retaliations to the military actions of a settler colonial state. This historical context is frequently ignored in favor of a narrative that focuses on Palestinian aggression against Israel. So the UK press either fails to report on atrocities against the Palestinian people, or else it continues to label these abuses as clashes and consistently misrepresents the systemic aggression and violence directed at Palestinians. You see, such framing serves only to legitimize and obscure the scale of oppression in occupied Palestine. This framing is reflected by the British government, who neglect to recognize both the suffering of the Palestinian people and the UK's complicity in this. The statements from the White House have been equally weak. President Biden failed to condemn blatant Israeli violations of international law. Not only that, but his administration signed off on $735 million of additional military arms sales to Israel on the 17th of May this year, at the very same time that bombs were raining down on Palestinian houses. That is in addition to the $3.8 billion in military aid that America provides Israel each year. Yet President Biden believes this is good value for money, as he has previously said that if there weren't an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region. America's indiscriminate use of the veto on the UN Security Council in matters relating to Israel is a major barrier to peace, as it was reported that the US blockade ceasefire resolutions 3 times during the latest bombardment. I take some hope in the fact that there are now a handful of brave women of color, members of Congress, who oppose Israel's illegal occupation and war crimes, including, of course, Rashida Tlaib, the first woman of Palestinian descent in Congress. Yet the international community must do much more to end the violations of international law, recognize the state of Palestine, and lay the foundations for a future of peace and justice. It must and can be possible for Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace, for Palestine to be free. International solidarity is vital in this struggle. And I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with everyone here and everyone in the UK and around the world who is committed to ending the historical marginalization of the Palestinian people. And as the voices of protest around the world say, up and down the UK and across the world, in major cities, towns, and everywhere, the mobilization has been real. The solidarity has been strong. And as they say, free, free Palestine. Thank you. Thank you, Shelley.
So much, Claudia. I thought that was a really crisp anti-imperialist analysis, and thank you for reminding us, of the role of our own government in all of this, both historically and today in the arms licensing that you were talking about. The Prime Minister couldn't say a few days ago whether or not any of those deaths in recent weeks were a result of British bombs. And I think all of this is a reminder why we make demands of our own government. And it's a reminder as well of the campaign for BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions, and why that's important, because it's action that we can take right here, right now. Just a reminder to any of you who are joining, I know some of you are watching on YouTube, but for those of you who are in the Zoom call, please do post any comments or questions that you'd like to be aired. You can send them to one of the hosts and we'll try and get through some of those as well. Okay, next we're going to be hearing from one of Stop the War's national officers, a young anti-imperialist activist who's played a leading role in organising a number of demonstrations. You might have seen him on the London demonstrations with the microphone getting people chanting. Really pleased to welcome you, Shabbir Lakha.
Thanks, Shelley, and thanks to Tariq and Claudia for what they've said. I thought that was a brilliant analysis, and it's great to see so many people still here. Obviously, over the last few weeks, we've seen the most horrific violence against the Palestinian people. We saw the bombs raining down on Gaza. We've seen the evictions of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and the ongoing ethnic cleansing. And the literal lynch mobs against Palestinians in Israel, and the ongoing revenge campaign by the Israeli military against Palestinians living in Israel, which has resulted in over 1,500 Palestinian citizens of Israel being arrested. And when I visited Palestine a couple of years ago, I saw with my own eyes what the Palestinians face, and I saw the violence that they face from settlers having their houses occupied, to the day-to-day brutality of the occupation. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of Western foreign policy in creating the conditions for what is happening to the Palestinian people. And I was going to start with that quote of Joe Biden that Claudia mentioned, that were there not an Israel, the US would have to invent an Israel to protect our interests. It's the best $3 billion investment the US has ever made. And I think this is one of the examples of things which Joe Biden should have said with his inside voice. But it characterizes the relationship between the US and Israel. It is a relationship based on imperialism. Israel is the US's outpost in the Middle East. And that's why the US gives Israel $3.8 billion in military aid every year. That's why the US covers for Israel at the United Nations, why Biden vetoed a ceasefire 3 times while Gaza was being bombed in the last couple of weeks. And we can see how this relationship plays out in terms of protecting US interests in the Middle East. When the senior military official Qasem Soleimani was assassinated last year in January, Netanyahu was informed about the strike before it happened when Congress wasn't. And for those few days where it looked like there was a potential of an escalation in the war with Iran, the US immediately mobilized its military resources in Israel. And we've also seen Israel participate in carrying out airstrikes in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon at the behest of the US, taking out so-called targets for them. And the very creation of Israel was for this purpose. Britain's Lord Balfour, who in 1905 passed the Aliens Act to stop Jewish refugees coming here, made the infamous declaration to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And Britain's military governor, Ronald Storrs, explained why. It was to create a Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. The creation of the State of Israel was always a colonialist endeavor because of its geostrategic location and, as Storrs said, in order to stop Arab resistance. And it's for this reason that the US allows Israel to ethnically cleanse, to bomb, to maim and kill Palestinians, because their struggle has from the start been an anti-imperialist struggle. And their struggle has always been of central importance to the wider struggle of the Arab people in the Middle East. That's why when you look at pictures of Tahrir Square in Egypt or the Pearl Roundabout in Bahrain in 2011, you'll see Palestinian flags. And what we've seen in the last few years with the decline of the US empire after its defeats in the wars in the Middle East and its attempt to grapple with maintaining its hegemony in the Middle East, we've seen the defeats in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, has all made Israel's role as a defender of the US interests all the more important. And, we were all glad to see the back of Donald Trump, but we shouldn't at the same time pretend that Biden isn't a continuation of that US imperialist foreign policy. Within a month of him becoming president, he authorized airstrikes on Syria. He authorized a $750 billion defense budget. While we've seen the end of US boots on the ground in Afghanistan and the formal withdrawal of Saudi's war in Yemen, although of course the US continues to back Saudi Arabia in its war in Yemen, these are positive developments, but they are part of a reorientation of US priorities, of more covert and economic and proxy methods of warfare to maintain its grip. And also a redirection of resources towards the new front of war in China, knowing that their loyal ally Israel is there to defend its interests in the Middle East. And I think this relationship, the US's foreign policy, and by extension, Britain's as its junior partner in this, is important to understand when we talk about the struggle for Palestinian freedom, because for one, it makes clear, as I said, that the Palestinian struggle is not only an anti-apartheid and an anti-racist struggle, it is an anti-imperialist one. And it also makes clear that Israel would not be able to do what it does without the full support of the US and Britain. And I think both these things in turn make it clear for us just how important our solidarity movement is and how important it is that the wider anti-war movement is central to the Palestine solidarity movement. In Britain, we have shown just how strong this movement is, from the 2003 demonstration against the Iraq war, where the slogans were "No war in Iraq, freedom for Palestine," through to the demonstration 10 days ago with 200,000 people marching through the streets of London in unity, all of which have had a fundamental role in shaping public opinion and in holding our government to account. And this movement is why the governments and the media, both in the US and here, continue to do so much to destabilize and delegitimize us. From the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, the prevent agenda, attempts to criminalize BDS, which in the United States they've successfully passed in a number of states. And as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, and with Gavin Williamson's letter to a number of schools, the attempt to stop school students from speaking out in any way in support of Palestine. But that's exactly why we need to keep fighting, and we need to keep our movement united and keep growing. And we need to keep occupying the streets. And we're going to be demonstrating on the 12th of June outside Downing Street when Biden is here, when the G7 summit is happening. And what we're seeing in Palestine is a new phase in the struggle. In the face of extreme violence, they are resisting, and it's our duty to stand with them. So solidarity, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Shabbir. Thank you for the plug for the protest on the 12th of June. If people haven't got that in their diaries yet, please get it in there. And if any of you want to hear from more from Shabbir, he will be speaking at the Birmingham Stop the War meeting or Zoom meeting next week, Tuesday the 8th. It's on Palestine is the mass upsurge in Israel, exposing it as an apartheid state. We will post a link in the chat, so if anyone wants to join that, they can. I've also got a comment here from Tony, who's asked, without repeatedly protesting week after week, what action is the best way for each of us to bring forward the day when justice for the Palestinians becomes a reality? That may well be a good question for our next speaker, who is a representative from Britain's largest pro-Palestinian organisation that has helped to mobilise those hundreds of thousands to the streets in recent weeks, and of course, mobilise over a number of years as well. He's a director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Please welcome Ben Jamal.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you. And look, Shabbir and Claudia in particular have given a very good context, I think, in terms of how we understand what is happening in the context of US imperialism. I want to add something in terms of just how more narrowly we understand the events of the past few weeks. Firstly, in the context of how they speak to the central question of how we understand the framework of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And secondly, how we understand the historic mobilizations that have happened globally in solidarity with that struggle over the past few weeks, in which the UK has been to the fore, certainly in terms of the numbers that have been mobilized in demonstrations, not just the numbers, the huge numbers marching in consecutive weeks in London, but remembering that those demonstrations were matched by more than 80 demonstrations happening in towns and cities across the UK. And finally, just to say something, and in doing that, maybe I can address part of Tony's question. What do Palestinians need from us as we build on the momentum that has been established? Let me just say, first of all, Tariq said, and in many ways he's right, that in some ways we've been here before. There are aspects of the script that has been read out over the past few weeks that we have seen before. Israel launches a major assault upon Gaza. Huge numbers of Palestinians are killed. A ceasefire is eventually called. Israel seeks to portray this situation as one of it responding to rocket fire from a terrorist enclave, that it's exercising its right of self-defense. The reaction of the international community, certainly of international governments, largely follows that script. Criticism of Israel is framed within questions of proportionality, of excessive use of force, and the demand during the bombardment becomes, how do we restore calm? How do we end the violence? And we have seen previously, particularly in 2009 and 2014, huge mobilizations of people in solidarity with the Palestinians in response to those assaults. So many of the components are the same, but there are some different factors that we should not lose sight of. Firstly, the scale of the protests was significantly larger here in the UK than anything that we have seen before. Historic numbers marching in support of the Palestinian people. Secondly, in the case of these mobilizations, they occurred not just in the context of a major assault on Gaza, but as others have said, as a reaction to what was happening preceding that assault in Sheikh Jarrah. So an ongoing process of ethnic cleansing that was culminating in court cases to try to legalize the forced expulsion from their homes of families who had lived in them for decades, that led to significant grassroots mobilizations on the ground in East Jerusalem that got brutally repressed by Israeli forces, including assaults on those praying at Al-Aqsa. And then that was what led to Hamas's response and Israel's assault upon Gaza. But the final additional component was a unification of protests by Palestinians that had not been seen for decades. Those resisting in Sheikh Jarrah and in Gaza being joined by Palestinian citizens in Israel, who were then subject to brutal attacks, lynchings in towns and cities across Israel. Now, all of this is deeply destabilizing and concerning to Israel and to its allies. What sustains Western support for Israel, or seeks to rationalize and justify it, is a narrative that frames Israel as a liberal democracy engaged at worst in a temporary occupation that only endures because Israel does not have the ability to hand over any territory, because what is required, we are told, is some form of territorial compromise, does not have the ability to hand over any territory to any entity that it could trust to establish a peaceful and stable state. All of that, of course, is manifestly untrue. And what people were witnessing and reacting to over the past few weeks is what I described in one of the speeches I gave at a recent demonstration as the naked, raw, brutal, unvarnished face of the system of power that Israel has established over Palestinians, system built upon a regime of institutionalized discrimination that meets the definition of apartheid. Apartheid visited on Palestinians in Gaza in the form of a brutal siege on Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank through the rubric of military occupation that continues to colonize their land, ethnically cleanse them from their homes, deny their freedom of movement, and if they protest, takes them and their children into military custody, where they are most likely to be subjected to torture. Apartheid visited upon Palestinian citizens of Israel through bodies of law and policy that discriminates against them in terms of their rights to own property, to settle, determines where they can reside, and together creates an overarching body of law that establishes them as second-class citizens. And finally, apartheid visited upon the bulk of Palestinians, those who live outside of the territories, the descendants of those expelled from their homes in 1948, denied the right to return, whilst simultaneously the right to settle and become citizens is granted to any Jew anywhere in the world, regardless of any established generational connection to the land. So the uprisings in Palestine as well, we need to remember, came in the context of attempts by Israel, supported by Trump, to effectively eliminate the Palestinian cause entirely through the establishment of the Abraham Accords and the other components we saw of Trump's so-called deal of the century, removing the right to a capital in Jerusalem, trying to redefine the status of refugee, so it was removed from the descendants of those expelled, and therefore taking the right of return entirely off the table. It also came, these uprisings came in the context of brutal repression on the ground over many years of human rights defenders. And as others have spoken about, it came in the context of a global attempt to suppress the solidarity movement by defining advocacy for Palestine, and in particular support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions as inherently anti-Semitic. And we all know that that has been an extremely successful campaign that has created a chilling effect on advocacy for Palestine. So what we have seen in the past few weeks is a revival of popular grassroots resistance on the ground in Palestine, but also a refusal by the solidarity movement, an uprising, a refusal to be silenced in the face of attempts to delegitimize it. And this is manifest not just in the numbers of people mobilized, but in the demographics of those protesting. As Shelley said at the start of this meeting, what was noticeable were the numbers of young people, but what was also noticeable were the numbers of demonstrations happening in school grounds across the UK. So let me conclude by coming to this. What are the key tasks for us as we respond to this moment? Firstly, to mainstream and foreground the narrative of oppression that Palestinian civil society has maintained for decades, but is now being picked up and mainstreamed by the human rights establishment, that of apartheid. And secondly, to listen to the clear message that Palestinians give to us when they ask us to show solidarity. And that message is stark and is clear. When we ask Palestinians, what is it you want us to do? The answer they give is simple: end your complicity. End the complicity of our governments through its political, diplomatic, military and financial support with Israel, including an end to all trade that supports apartheid, including the arms trade. End the complicity of our public bodies, the universities that invest in complicit companies, the pension companies that also invest millions of pounds in companies supporting Israel's system of apartheid, and end the complicity of those corporations and companies themselves by directly targeting them. So we have to keep up the momentum, directly answering the question of what do we do next. Shabbir has already talked about a demonstration that's taking place on June the 12th. We need to mobilize for that. On June the 26th, we will be organizing a Palestine block as part of the People's Assembly March. And tomorrow, PSC is announcing 3 days of action in July with 3 focuses, all under the slogan, take action, end apartheid, support BDS. July the 9th is the 16th anniversary of the launch of the Palestinian call for BDS. So on the 8th of March, the 8th of July, we're going to be organizing a lobby of Parliament, calling for sanctions and an end to the arms trade. On July the 9th, there will be a mobilization amongst students, a student day of action, calling for an end to the complicity in terms of universities' investments. And on July the 10th, we're calling for a day of action, a national day of action to support BDS campaigns. Our task, our responsibility is to commit ourselves to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, never to stop protesting, never to stop lobbying, never to stop marching, never to stop boycotting until they enjoy what is their birthright: freedom, justice and equality in their historic homeland.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you most of all for that last little bit there of what we can do and what's coming up in terms of how we take solidarity action, but also such a clear and kind of key background and context in your contribution there. And I really think every contribution that we've heard tonight has been really excellent and brought something different. So I'm really, really grateful to you and everybody else who's spoken so far. Like you say, we've got to mainstream what's happening, but we've also got to mainstream our opposition to it. And we've seen, as you say, that chilling effect, particularly against some really, young people, students in schools speaking out in recent weeks, which we absolutely have to resist. And that brings me to some of the comments that have been coming through. And if any of the next speakers want to draw on any of these comments or questions, please feel free. But Sadfine here says, is there anywhere we can signpost people who want to learn more about the situation? Colleagues and students have asked me about it, and I feel like I can't discuss it because it's viewed as a controversial topic. Keith here asks, what proportion of the Israeli population is genuinely supportive of the Palestinian cause? Steve asks, as an American living in Britain, it appears to me that Israel is becoming more of a liability than an asset of the US. What do you think? Interesting. Olfat says, can we connect the dots between what's happening in Yemen and the occupied Palestinian territories? The US is involved in both. Violence blockades are applied on civilians in both cases. And I'll add to that, Britain is also complicit in both. Britain is now the biggest arms supplier in Saudi's assault on Yemen. So really good question there. Thank you. And again, just a reminder about that date that we've heard a couple of times now, Saturday, the 12th of June, outside Downing Street, as we demand our own government ends its arms sales to Israel. Next up, we've got a founding member and patron of Stop the War, a leading figure in Birmingham Stop the War Coalition, a fantastic activist, Salma Yaqoob. Salma, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you to all the panelists who have spoken so inspiringly. And thank you to the hundreds of people who have joined tonight. Actually, just having this meeting itself is so key. I find myself this week being accused of being divisive. I don't know whether to be flattered or alarmed that in the Telegraph, I'm singled out as a threat to multiracial Britain. And if I share with you what my naughty activity was, it was actually because it happened to go down the Saturday before to that fantastic, huge pro-Palestinian demonstration. And I'll give you the headline that I gave for that. It's saying, according to Nick Timothy, former advisor to Theresa May. We're not drifting into segregation, we're hurtling perilously towards it, because there's a growing mood of sectarianism threatening to undo the many successes of multiracial Britain. And I think we need to fix that, because what's happening is there's a growing solidarity movement in Britain. It's not, it's the opposite of divisiveness. It's about people coming together in the name of humanity, in the name of solidarity. And we're here to say we need to stop the impunity of Israel. No one here has been asking for special treatment for Palestinians or for Israelis to have bad treatment. What we are demanding is to have fair treatment and to stop having special treatment in terms of indulging the Israeli regime, which couldn't do what it did without our government's direct involvement, with its political cover, with the arms that are going to it. And of course, the United States is absolutely key. And we've got, and tonight's discussion clearly had Biden as a focus. And it's very interesting that whilst Biden's demeanor clearly is very, very different from Trump, what we actually saw in this latest round of aggression, which any human being around the world could see, is absolutely horrific and should have ended immediately. That there was a delay. The ceasefire was not demanded by the American regime until actually the Israelis actually felt that maybe they hadn't got the political and strategic aims they had aimed for. That could have come in from day one. So the fact that Biden stayed quiet until we saw the huge uprisings, and again, I'm accused of being divisive because I use the word intifada. Intifada means uprising, peaceful uprising. And I'm proud to say that we here are part of that peaceful intifada, that peaceful uprising. The Palestinians are leading the way, but it's an uprising which is global and international. It's a point that is almost, whilst inspiring, it's sad, but I like to look on the optimistic side. A few years ago, I would have considered myself as an activist, as somebody who was acting in solidarity with people who had less voice and less power, because we come from a place of privilege, and that we were somehow extending our benign solidarity. Today, I actually feel humbled by the courage, the determination, the samud, that's what the Arabic word for resilience, steadfastness, and the leadership the Palestinians are giving us, and giving us heart in the uprising, because we here in the West are now facing our own censorship and silencing. Growing up, I couldn't even get my head around how a blatant occupation could be sold as anything but that. How being pro-Palestinian was even a question, you know, when the injustice was so obvious. How awful a regime must be that it silenced its own people to ask for justice. And yet we are finding here in the so-called mother of democracy that those same curtailing of freedom, the same curtailing of political freedoms to meet, to challenge things that we've taken for granted, I've taken for granted growing up in this country, that line has come right here. So we're in a twin struggle right now. We're in a struggle to extend our solidarity as we've done for many decades, but actually, we're actually fighting for our own political rights and our own political freedoms. And it's the Palestinians who I think are giving us courage and inspiration by showing that no matter what they have faced, you know, we're facing political censorship and maybe a threat to people's jobs because they're getting accused of being anti-Semitic, because a deliberate conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has been allowed to go unchallenged, I would say, you know, and I think the left made a mistake by not challenging that more openly and really bringing to light what was going on. And so we're in that fight now for freedom of speech. The left have been very much beaten down and put on the defensive because of an acceptance of a certain frame. And this was always about imperialism. This was always about control. It's about controlling the land, it's about controlling the arms, and it's about controlling the language. And to coin a phrase, we need to take back control. We need to gain our confidence. We need to be able to assert unapologetically that we are on the side of humanity. And our ask is not actually complicated. One of the great injustices on this whole issue is how it's presented as, oh gosh, it's so complicated. It's about, two people competing over the same land, and perhaps it's one of those things that can never ever be solved. Well, actually, the solution has been agreed. We don't need any more negotiations. It may come as a surprise to some people on this call even, that the Palestinians actually gave up so many of their rights for the sake of peace. They agreed to give up 78% of their land. They agreed to only have 22% of what had been their historic homeland for the sake of peace. They gave up half of Jerusalem, accepting only East Jerusalem. And so all they've asked for is 22% of the land, a right to return, not even to the direct places that people had been violently kicked out from, but at least to be able to come back to that 22%. So many people still denied that. But until now, Israel has not abided by those agreements. They're there. The international agreements are there. The United Nations upholds the Palestinians' rights. And what's happened is, it's not that the Palestinians are not upholding their end of the bargain, it's that they haven't been given a state. They are still subjected to illegal occupation. These settlements are not recognised by international law. And in fact, any country which is supporting such illegal settlements is itself in breach of international law. So we find ourselves as the UK and the United States actually breaching the very law that we claim to be upholders of. So the solution here is very simple. This could not be happening without the support, explicit support of other countries. And as soon as that is withdrawn, this issue can be solved. Because what the Israelis are doing, in one way, if we take a step back, is very rational. Why on earth would they not keep taking more and more? Why on earth would they abide by international agreements, which they find uncomfortable, if no matter what they do, they are still given money, they are still given arms, and the Palestinians are allowed to suffer the way they have been? Because that's the situation we're finding ourselves in, which is why our solidarity movement is so important. The international solidarity movement, just as in the case of South African apartheid, but I would argue actually even more so. The situation in that tiny strip of land, which has caused so much misery for so many decades and has implications for peace and war around the world. Actually, as I say, the solutions are there. They just need to be implemented. The International Criminal Court to be applied to Israel and any Palestinians. The Palestinians have agreed to it, including Hamas, which cuts out any of those issues around war crimes. The land dispute, as it's still called, has been settled. The Palestinians compromised, but they still have not been given recognition for even what they had been prepared to give up and the bits that they had been prepared to accept. So there will be no movement until the international community itself stops siding with the aggressor. There is no impartiality here. That's the crux of the problem. And in fact, the aggressor, the occupier, is being rewarded. Even in this latest round of violence, and the Americans gave hundreds of millions of pounds of extra aid. There were one or two instances over the last few decades, in the 1980s and the 1970s, when the American regime simply said, we're not going to give the next round of funding. And Israel very, very quickly complied with what it was supposed to do in those instances. So I'm not here even arguing that the Israeli population is going to somehow sort this out. We know that the right-wing trend has been growing and growing. And as I say, when the political situation on the ground is such that they have everything to gain by continuing this belligerent, unfair, inhumane attitude, I'm not looking for that solution. Of course, we always salute any efforts around humanity, around justice, any solidarity between the Palestinians and Israelis, and there are pockets of that. But from my perspective, this situation arose because of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, before the Second World War, before the absolutely genocidal Holocaust. There was land appropriation going on, settlement and takeover of Palestinian land. So this whole twinning of the Holocaust narrative and denial of what happened between 1917 and when the British mandate took over and when the British mandate ended, that has not been recognised. That how that dispossession started then. In 1947, the Israelis actually totally breached what even the United Nations had given them. The United Nations gave an unfair settlement. They gave 55% of Palestine's historic homeland to a minority population, which wouldn't be fair by any standard of justice. But even that was breached, such that in 1967, they took over 78% of the land. And at that point, even then, for the sake of peace, the Palestinians were willing to compromise. So when people say to you, you find the Palestinians gave up, that is not what this is about. What this is about is Palestinians who've already been expelled violently, being denied the right to return. It's about creating such terrible conditions that the Palestinians who remain feel that it's better for them to leave. And this is why I pay tribute, not just for the peaceful intifada, but the samud, the resilience and the determination and the lack of giving up. Because I can tell you, I mean, I'll be honest, there are times when I feel like giving up, and even with all the luxuries that we have in our country, when you face all the kind of attacks and the malign, when your character's attacked, when your job's on the line, it's easy for us to feel down and disheartened. But when you see that total consistency and that dignity, and that we would rather carry on in this struggle rather than give up our rights, because we know that right is on our side. And I believe, just like slavery, just like the colonial occupations of the past, that one day this injustice will be redressed. One day we will look back on this apartheid regime the way that the South African regime is looked back on. But in the meantime, the struggle is on. And we're at a point, actually, that we are stronger than we have been for decades. We went from just a few months ago, one moment, somebody at the door. This is what it's like with the Zoom meeting.
I'm going to have to wrap you up anyway, Salma. So this.
Hang on. June the 12th, make sure you're there. Actually, now the people who had us on the back foot are on the back foot, because the mask has come off. It's obvious what is happening. Let's take heart. Let's be confident. See you on June the 12th.
Thank you so much, Salma. You better go get the door. Thank you so much for that, and hopefully, you can stick around for the rest of the meeting anyway. I see that as a message to not forget the importance of our solidarity movement. We are part of the Intifada, and what the action that we take here, the pressure that we apply on our own governments, can make a difference, can reverberate around the world. Before I come to our last speaker, we've had another comment come in here, asking. The silence from the Labour Party over recent weeks has been apparent. How do panelists suggest we engage and pressure the party to be the voice of those demanding justice for the Palestinians here in Britain? That's from Mustafa. I think we've still got Claudia with us, so I might come back to her on that one. But certainly last and by no means least, finally, I'm really pleased that our friend, musician, rapper, activist, Lowkey is able to join us. Lowkey, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shelley. It's great to be here. The Palestinians are aching to be free from imperialism, colonialism, and its sequels. They have been articulating their unfreedom for many decades. Our job here is not only to interpret and translate those yearnings for justice, but also to coordinate directly with them. They are striking back against the hauntology of a continuous Nakba. Palestinian resistance against Zionism and ethnic cleansing remains here from the 1880s to today, the longest continual anti-colonial struggle in the world. This struggle, the Palestinian cause, represents a universal struggle for justice. When we look at the population of Gaza, we have to remember that it's estimated to grow by 5,000 people every single month. That is about 60,000 people a year. In 20 years, you will be looking at a population of 5 million people in the world's largest open-air prison, where the status quo is 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day, 2 to 3 hours of running water every few days. And this last war has displaced 75,000 people. This blockade remains illegal under international law. It's known to be a form of collective punishment against a civilian population. During the last campaign, hundreds of private properties, among them government sites, banks, mosques, schools, health facilities, all were severely damaged. You also saw the destruction of power and water networks and many, many meters of important paved roads. The Israeli forces bombed the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund and Al-Saleh charitable school for orphans. How can we forget that 1,500 of those orphans were created in the 2014 war alone? Let's not forget that Israeli journalist Amira Hass pointed out something very important. When the bombing of a house takes place, it follows a decision from higher up people that are backed by the examination and approval of military jurists. Now, for the Israeli authorities to call people's phones within Gaza and warn them of impending strikes, it is a fact that they have a population registry of every single residential home in Gaza. For them to strike buildings and kill civilians, it means that it was a seriously considered action. Now, the Palestinian resistance doesn't have military bases or tanks or fighter jets or precision targeting head-up display units made by BAE Systems or Iron Dome systems that Obama bought for them. What Israel has had to deal with is the falling apart of its policy of fragmentation of the Palestinians. They have responded as a unified movement. Remember, the IDF is a reserve army, meaning that when it engages militarily in this way, it has to call people up from the Israeli economy and leave jobs uncarried out. Remember that a huge percentage, as we will go into later, of the vital backbone of the Israeli economy are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and Palestinians in the West Bank. The ungovernability of Palestinians during this period contributed to the fall of the shekel as a currency. And yes, they tell us that the Palestinian resistance is terrorism. Well, let me ask you this. If you have the United States, the UK, the EU, and Israel say that, well, the United States represents 331 million people. The UK represents 66 million people. Israel represents 9 million people. The EU supposedly represents 446 million people, okay? That's around 861 million people, supposedly, that view the Palestinian resistance as terrorism. You know who doesn't view the Palestinian resistance as terrorism? The 8.5 million people represented by the government of Switzerland, the 223 million people represented by the government of Pakistan, the 82 million people represented by the government of Turkey, the 1.4 billion people represented by the government of China, the 144 million people represented by the government of Russia, the 82 million people represented by the government of Iran, and the 28 million people represented by the government of Venezuela. I could go on. A vast majority of humanity stands with Palestinian resistance to Zionist colonization. We can never forget that UN Resolution 3246 makes clear that the Palestinians specifically have the right to liberate themselves from foreign occupation through armed struggle. During this period, Israel killed over 25 Palestinians in the West Bank, including 4 children, but absolutely essential and integral to the process of squashing this movement has been the Palestinian Authority. None of us can forget how Mahmoud Abbas said several years ago to a room full of Israeli journalists, "At-tansiq al-amni muqaddas," security coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority is sacred. Those were his words, not mine. We have seen dozens of Palestinians arrested in the West Bank. Some of them have been confronted with claims that they insulted Yasser Arafat. Also, we have seen Palestinian demonstrations in the West Bank squashed by tear gas from the PA. There's evidence of torture being used against Palestinians. And let's not forget that when Benny Gantz came here and met with Dominic Raab, he made clear that the Israeli aim, in Benny Gantz's words, is to strengthen the PA. Now, how did Israel deal with ungovernability within the Green Line, the Palestinian citizens of the Israeli state? Now, they suffer from a plurality of alienations. According to legal rights group Adala, there are over 50 laws within the Israeli state that impose inequality between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel. The wages of Israelis, of Jewish Israelis, are 35% higher than Palestinian citizens of Israel. 50% of Palestinians within Israel live below the poverty line. But you cannot forget, there are 65,000 Palestinian construction workers within Israel. And the Israeli Builders Association found that only 150 of those 65,000 Palestinian construction workers came to work during the strike. According to the Israeli Builders Association, it incurred losses of $40 million just by those tens of thousands of Palestinian construction workers not coming to work. The vice president of the Builders Association made absolutely clear, we cannot build without them. The transportation ministry in Israel said that 10% of all bus drivers did not show up for work. It meant that 300 journeys had to be cancelled. 47% of pharmacists within the state of Israel are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. Despite the fact that the mayor of Lid at one point called for the IDF to be mobilized to Lid, the Israeli city largely inhabited by Palestinians, that did not happen because the IDF could not extend itself to that point. The very limitations of the Israeli state and of the Zionist colonization of Palestine have been scandalized and exposed by this unified resistance. And what about the rest of the Arab countries? Even in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, you saw the #1 Twitter trend while this was happening, Palestine Qadiyati, Palestine is my cause. This was the #1 trend in those countries. And moreover, you are now seeing a convergence between the military wing and the political wing of the resistance in regards to regional affairs. This will be very important in terms of the development of what happens and the balance of power. Now, Joe Biden gives to Israel $10.4 million a day, $430,000 an hour, $7,229 a minute, and $120 a second of US taxpayers' money in a state that does not have universal health care to racist Zionist apartheid in Palestine. And not just that, tomorrow, Israel will announce that they are requesting $1 billion more in emergency aid from the US government. This is the biggest piece of proof that Israel were defeated in this war. What are they offering to Gaza? $5.5 million to rebuild from the United States. How can that rebuild hundreds and hundreds of buildings? How are they attempting to squash this? Well, the social media side of things really represented another aspect of defeat for Israel. We know that previously, as the Palestinian Prisoners Studies Center found between 2015 and 2018, over 500 Palestinians, among them children, were arrested due to their activity on social media by the IDF. But censorship has been rife. You have seen the accounts of Palestinians within Palestine deleted. You have seen some of my posts censored. You've seen posts of many people across the world in solidarity with the Palestinians who have seen their posts censored. Now we have to look critically at these organizations. Whitney Webb's investigation found that in Google, you have 28 former members of Unit 8200 in the IDF working within the organization. What does that mean for their partiality? She also found that Microsoft had at least 15 former Unit 8200 in the IDF working in Microsoft. She also found that there were 13 at least former Unit 8200 alumni working for Facebook. We also know that the Anti-Defamation League, a well-known Israel lobby group that was appointed as a trusted flagger organization by YouTube. Perhaps that explains the kinds of censorship we are seeing on YouTube. At very least, it should represent a conflict of interest. Israel cannot squash this without raw, naked fascism. We know that Vladimir Jabotinsky, is actually one of the most important figures, if not the most important figure, in the trajectory of the Zionist movement. He has more streets and parks named after him in the state of Israel than any other figure from Israeli history. Now, Jabotinsky was a great admirer of Mussolini. So many would look at it today and not see that much amiss with somebody like Tommy Robinson attending a pro-Israeli demonstration outside the embassy in tandem with the Israeli ambassador. When we look at who funded organizations like Middle East Forum and the David Horowitz Freedom Center that have employed Tommy Robinson in the last few years, it's quite clear. These very same organizations, from the Herzog Foundation to the Klarman Family Foundation, also funded, along with the organizations that employed Tommy Robinson, also funded Elad, the settler group in Sheikh Jarrah, which is intent on ethnically cleansing Jerusalem. We have to talk about what is happening in the schools in Britain. You have seen children reprimanded by their school for very simple acts of solidarity, from fundraising for Palestinian charities, to wearing a kufiya, to a face mask with Free Palestine on it, or even just saying the words Free Palestine. You are seeing them intimidated, accused of being anti-Semites, suspended, and even in some cases expelled from school. Now, how is the British state dealing with this? Well, Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of Education, pointed head teachers in a letter to 3 organizations, and I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. One of the organizations goes by the name of the Community Security Trust. Now, they receive £14 million in public funding a year, supposedly to protect Jewish communities. However, when we look closer at this organization, we can see clearly that it not only coordinates with Israel's external intelligence services, it also receives training from them. According to Anthony Lerman, founder of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, not only does that training take place, but also the Community Security Trust has been found to be giving lists of anti-Zionist Jews to the Home Office as extreme groups. We look at the other organization, Solutions Not Sides. They have come out of and grown out of an organization called One Voice Europe, which also receives government funding in the hundreds of thousands. Now, who is on their board? Gideon Grinstein, founder of the Roy Institute, a well-known Zionist security think tank that has been at the forefront of the global campaign to sabotage the Palestine solidarity movement. Who else is on the One Voice Europe board? Russell Mishkon, who serves as a consultant to the London legal giant Mishkon de Reya. Mishkon de Reya is one of the most important go-to law firms for Israel in mobilizing and squashing the BDS campaign. Who are the other advisors that populate this organization, One Voice Europe? Well, you have Danny Rothschild, the former Israeli military governor of the West Bank, Martin Indink, who was the US ambassador to Israel and has lobbied for Israel in the past. Are these partisan actors or not? Quite clearly they are. Are these organizations the right people to be? And you have to even look at the framing from Gavin Williamson. Supposedly this is to deal with an uptick in anti-Semitism at schools. That's not what happened. That's not what's happening. These children are responding to very easily evidenced war crimes and are stating who their solidarity lies with. I'm not against learning about Palestine from the perspective of Zionist actors. Moshe Dayan himself went on to become the defense minister of Israel. He put it this way: Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab Palestinian villages. There is not one single place built in this country that did not have a former Arab population. We could even learn about it from the perspective of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who put it this way: Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population, because every indigenous people will resist alien settlers. Now, what must we do here? Let's be absolutely clear. When Benjamin Netanyahu poses in front of F-16 fighter jets that were used to destroy homes, health facilities, and other vital places in Gaza, and threatens to make an example of Gaza, remember that Britain's biggest arms company, BAE Systems, makes the HUD technology for target selection in that F-16. Britain is involved. And you know what's even worse is those components in the F-16 and F-35 could well have been built by people who are members of unions that passed BDS motions 10 years ago. It is time to put pressure on those unions and say, put your policy where your mouth is. Let's call on the NEU to stand with children in schools. Let's call on our universities who have over 450 million pounds invested in companies involved in Israeli crimes, from weapons to illegal Zionist colonies. Let's call on those universities. Let's mobilize those students. Let's look at the 10.8 billion pounds worth of shares in arms companies that War on Want found. The investments and the shares that exist in those arms companies that are held by financial institutions in this country, whether it's HSBC or Barclays. We have the responsibility to pressure those institutions. We must not let up, and we must play our role in this global intifada.
Thank you so much, Lowkey. As always, an excellent, really powerful contribution. Talking about, from the vast numbers of people worldwide who stand with Palestinians to the huge impact of that Palestinian general strike. Amazing numbers that you referenced there among construction workers alone. And amid the grave injustices and oppression is an inspiring struggle of resistance that we must continue to support, we must continue to build support for. I'm really glad that you ended there by talking about the struggle in schools and how we put pressure on educational institutions, because Humaira asked, what should our response be to schools who oppose children from speaking up about Palestine? I just want to come back to each of the panelists really quickly, if you can keep it as close to a minute or 2 minutes as possible. We've got a few more minutes just to give your thoughts on any of the questions that I've read out throughout this, or just any final closing comments. Just as a bit of a recap, we had the question from Mustafa about how we influence the Labour Party in support of Palestine. Tonight we've largely focused on Palestine, but there was also Ulfat had a question about the parallels with Britain's support for the war on Yemen as well. And Sadfin asked about where we can signpost people to get more information. Claudia, if I can come to you, and then I'll go to Shabbir.
Hi, I'm not really going to say much more because I think it's all been said already, but obviously we've just got to maintain the level of solidarity, the rise in support across the board, the mobilization across the world, the strikes that we are seeing in solidarity need to continue to be supported. Really, it is solidarity and a grassroots movement that is going to break the systemic oppression that we are seeing of the Palestinians. The Palestinian people are resilient people, and we should never forget the resilience that exists. But we are seeing those atrocities affect so many children, so many young people, and what we are seeing is really actually just the tip of the iceberg, because what life is like on the ground, we know all too well, is even worse than what we are seeing. We know that the collateral damage that the power of the politicians do, alongside actually the power of corporates and the power of the media does, this is those powerful forces that keep this whole thing sustained, really, and we have to break that down. And that starts, of course, here in the UK with continuously challenging the government, and therefore what we do in Parliament. And, you know, I can't understand if we are socialists in Parliament, our role really, what we were elected on, is to stand on the line in protest, in opposition to these human rights abuses. And if we aren't doing that, then what are we doing? If we aren't opposing the government's continuous arming of oppressive regimes like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, then what are we about? If we aren't relentlessly pursuing that agenda to stop arming these oppressive regimes, then what are we about? If we aren't standing in solidarity, shoulder to shoulder, with young people, with everyone protesting across here in the UK and across the world, then what are we about? So I know what our role is in Parliament and what our role as socialists is, and I just hope that that sense of unity, solidarity, and togetherness continues. And just one further thing, we need to see, here in Leicester, we were so inspired by the Fire Brigades Union that stood in solidarity against those that were protesting, with those that were protesting on the Elbit arms factory, that which was making military equipment that is being used on Palestinians, and the huge protest that came out, and the Fire Brigades Union said no. They said no, and we need more of that, more of industries and unions and workers down in tool and saying we are not going to military, you know, we're not going to support the military attacks, and equally we're not going to build the JCBs and ship them over that are going to continue those illegal settlements as well. So it's workers' power. That's why the general strike was important. It's people power. That's why our movements are important. And it's changing the politics, of course, and overcoming what the mainstream is saying in terms of the press. That's why we need independent press, a diversity of press, and that's why we must keep supporting those organizations, and finally keep supporting Stop the War, because this is a movement that's about peace and justice and global solidarity. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Claudia. Shabbir, if I can come to you really, really briefly.
Yeah, thanks. I'll try and be very quick. I think just firstly on the Labour Party, I think Keir Starmer has backed himself into a position of declaring, you know, any kind of solidarity with the Palestinian people as potentially being anti-Semitic. And I think it's been shameful, the attacks that he's been a part of on socialists who stood with Palestine, and it explains the silence of the Labour Party in the recent weeks. But I think, as we've seen with the plans that Starmer had to abstain on the police and crime bill, which was then changed by the protests against that bill, we can have an impact on shaping the Labour Party and pushing those positions from the movement, from the streets, from our communities. And in the same way, in shaping public opinion, I know someone asked about that, and I just wanted to mention a 2015 survey of Jewish people in Britain, which found that 71% of British Jews support Palestinian self-determination, 75% oppose settlement expansion, 24% support sanctions on Israel. And these were all figures that were massively increased from the same survey done in 2010, which shows you the effect that the movement has had on public opinion. And this is within British Jews, and I suspect it's on a much bigger scale in the wider population. So I think the key is that we need to keep mobilizing. We need to keep being visible. I think, as has been mentioned, the general strike of the Palestinian people, which showed that a united response from the river to the sea has been an absolute turning point. And I think we need to stand with them and build that solidarity. And yeah, absolutely, please get involved with Stop the War, and let's keep this movement going.
Thanks so much, Shabbir. I wanted to get to everybody to come back to just for a brief comments and response to questions, but I don't think we're going to get the chance. I just want to ask Ben, on behalf of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, to quickly recap us on what those upcoming events and actions are, dates for your diaries. Ben? There we go.
Can I be really cheeky and just pick up on one thing that Lowkey said, and then I'll come straight to the events, because it also reflects. Somebody asked a question about, are there groups inside Israel that we should be working with? What's the level of support, of solidarity there? And there are groups, but they are all, groups like Breaking the Silence, B'Tselem, they're all defined by one thing. They are groups that work under a framework of co-resistance, of supporting Palestinians in their resistance to injustice by naming and tackling that injustice. What Lowkey was talking about, and he's absolutely right, are groups that we would define as coexistence projects, who reframe the situation and say this is not a problem of a struggle against injustice. This is a problem of two peoples with a lack of understanding of each other's narratives, and we need to bring them together so they can share each other's stories. It's equivalent to under South African apartheid saying the problem is that Black South Africans really just didn't understand the position of white South Africans and vice versa. And we all remember what Desmond Tutu said about such narratives. So this is really important because it is being pushed by the government, but it is also being pushed. These projects, coexistence projects, are also being pushed by the hierarchy in the Labour Party. Lisa Nandy recently spoke at a conference of a coalition of such groups called ULMEP, of which One Voice, that Lowkey spoke about, is one of the founders of that coalition. So we need to resist that. And he's also absolutely right. This has been pushed at schools. I understand the position of heads who do not understand, who do I bring in to address this issue properly? So we've got to make sure they get that information. But we need bodies like the NEU to speak up and say, we will not support any framing of this issue that does not speak to the facts of history, the established facts of history, and does not speak to principles of support for international law and support for basic rights. On the events, demonstrate on June the 12th, be there as part of the Palestine bloc at the People's Assembly on the 26th. And then July the 8th is going to be a lobby of Parliament, support that. The tools to do that will be sent out within a week or so. July the 9th, we are having a student day of action with a demonstration for students and young people in London. Give your support in any way you can to that. And then on July the 10th, there is a BDS day of action with a focus on, in particular, on the Puma campaign, with actions taking place at stores across the country. Give your full support to that as well.
Thank you so much, Ben. And can I just say again to all the speakers, a massive, massive thank you. I think tonight's discussion has been really, really valuable. I think every contribution has been excellent. If you are joining us tonight and you're not already a member of Stop the War Coalition, please do join. And if you're not already signed up to our mailing list to hear about all those things that are coming up, please do sign up. Thanks once again. See you on the 12th of June on the streets and at many more meetings to come. Solidarity, everybody, and good night.